Okay, we left off before I had just mentioned the issue of lead time. Lead time is how long it takes to place an ad and but from the time you order it or the time you submit the um, finished advertisement until it actually gets shown on air or published. And this is something to take into account, uh, also in terms of the development and the production of, remember, if you remember, I talked about during the creative process discussion, how long it takes ad agencies to develop and produce a television ad. It could be a very long time. So when you're planning for, scheduling the media, you have to understand that, like newspapers have a very short lead time because they're getting printed every day, right? So you can just make a finished ad, call them up, and get it in the next day, or maybe it takes 2 days, if you have to schedule it. Or but the preferred positions you need to maybe schedule, much farther in advance. For a monthly magazine, if it's a monthly magazine, it's going to take basically a month, up to a month to get your ad published. And if you're counting on getting an inside cover or a back cover, those positions may already be taken. So you have to make these media buys, well in advance, and you also get better discounts if you're able to plan ahead and say, well, in 6 months from now, I'm going to have my television ad on air. Then you can make those media buys in advance and you'll get a better discount. But the lead time issue is something to think about when you're scheduling. Don't wait till the last minute. What else do we have? The actual calendar, approach to, when we're talking about scheduling, we have to think about, well, in terms of the yearly calendar, the calendar year, when will our ad campaign be on air or in market? And how do we want to schedule it? How do we want it to appear? And there's a few standard approaches. First of all is the continuous schedule. And this is like, well, if we have, just imagine that we have a budget of $120,000, right? With a continuous scheduling method, we would say, well, let's put $10,000 every month. And then we have a continuous amount of advertising every month, $10,000 worth of advertising. Like maybe the typical small business might spend about $10,000 a month on Google AdWords campaigns. Um, so that's, continuous. But if it actually may not be maybe for Google AdWords campaign, continuous advertising may be an appropriate method. But for other types of ads like, radio or billboard or out, or a television ad or, generally, it's not a very efficient use of your money. Because remember, there was this idea of the carryover effect. If you remember, the carryover effect said that, well, there's still some memory of the advertisement in the audience's mind, that even though the ad may not be showing, there's still some effect that happens. It retains it in their memory in between the time when you're showing it and when you're not showing it. So, uh, taking advantage of that, we have this other idea of pulsing, which is to periodically reduce the budget. So you maybe go 2 weeks heavy, 2 weeks light advertising, 2 weeks heavy, 2 weeks light. You just pulse like in Turkish it would be like nubuz, like your pulse, like your blood pulsing through your veins. Uh, and then there's flighting, which is actually to just completely reduce it to zero, the budget. So you have 2 weeks of a flight. A flight is like, think of a pulse, but even higher. It's flying high. It's a flight. So you're flighting it means like, okay, you have very high amounts of advertising, and maybe this way you'll stand out from the crowd too, right? With a continuous method, you're kind of flat. You have a continuous level of advertising. So maybe you're not really standing out because you're not spending a lot in any one period. But with flighting, you spend a very high amount for a short period, and then you reduce the budget to zero for a short period. For maybe, let's say go 2 weeks on, 1 week off, or 1 week on, 2 weeks off. It's up to you to decide. But the idea is that you spend a lot of money at one time and then you don't spend any money. And you just count on the carryover effect to sustain the brand and the memory of the consumers in between flights. And there's also what's known as bursting. Think of a cloud burst, like a thunderstorm. Suddenly it bursts on you. Well, bursting is like what happens when you have a very short time to make your effect. You don't have time to waste, like building up, frequency over a long time. So, for example, when new movies come out, right? Think of a new movie comes out, you see advertisements for it all over the place, all the time on television for just a couple of weeks, and then it's gone. Or if it's like a weekend sale, and you want to get people to come in, like on a holiday weekend or on Valentine's Day sale, and you just have just a short time to get people to do something. Then you just got to, pull out all the stops and just, heavily advertise. And we call that bursting. So here's just a diagram of the scheduling methods that we just talked about. So um, we have the calendar at the bottom of the months, and we show like this continuous, just imagine that block represents, a continuous amount of money being spent. So imagine like the budget is on the left side. This is not the best illustration. If I was with you in person, I would draw it a little bit differently, but um, here we have flighting. So we have flighting, they're spending some money in January, then there's this period of inactivity, and then again the flights. But if it was me, I would draw the flight to be a taller peak, right? Continuous, it looks like it's the same level. If you have one budget, imagine that, the money that you're not spending in February through June, you can spend on top of that, make the flighting taller, right? So it makes like a taller peak. And then pulsing, oh yeah, so the carryover effect, right, is this, again, this is what's sustaining the brand in the memory, hoping that you're still seeing some effect of the advertising in between the flights. And with pulsing, it goes up a little bit, go down a little bit, up a little bit, down a little bit, but there's always some background effect. And this is what maybe Coca-Cola does. Maybe flighting is more for seasonal ads, not always, but you can think of it something like that. Pulsing is more like, well, you want to at times stand out from the crowd, but you also want some background level of, constant reminder advertising like McDonald's or Coca-Cola does. Occasionally they do a new campaign, they do a lot of pulsing, spend a lot at that one time, and then they have some background. And then bursting is just like, okay, right before Christmas, we have toy ads, that just come on the scene and then they just advertise like crazy and then they don't advertise anymore. So let's talk about the last thing. This is the last slide. Hopefully I'll get through it. Commonalities of media. So in this decision making about media, strategy and planning, what do we have? Well, one common thing is that there's a trade-off between reach and frequency for a fixed budget, right? So we can draw that. Imagine, you have like a X and Y axis, right? And you have like, you go up on the left side, 1, 2, 3, 4, and that's the frequency. And on the bottom, on the Y-axis, um, wait a minute. No, on the y-axis is the vertical, sorry. So on the x-axis you have, um, let's say, a reach of 1,000, 2,000, 3,000, 4,000, right? People. Then for a fixed budget, you can either get 4,000 people to see an ad one time, or you can get 1,000 people to see an ad 4 times, right? It's the same gross ratings points. If you want to measure it in terms of GRPs, you get the same number of GRPs, you pay for those GRPs, but you can get high reach with low frequency or low reach with high frequency, right? There's this trade-off for a fixed budget. So the media planner and the marketer has to decide: do you want to emphasize reach or frequency? And this takes into account sometimes the complexity of the message, or whether it's a new product or a known product. There's a lot of factors that go into this decision. There's also a trade-off between the ability to have wide reach and narrow targeting, right? So if you're going to try to get lots of people in your audience, you're going to have wide reach, but you're probably going to have a lot of waste coverage. So, targeting very narrowly means you're actually lowering your numbers of people that are reached. And it's just a trade-off. You have to, decide, do you want to really have wide reach and perhaps maybe a little bit more waste, or do you want a really well-defined audience, but perhaps not as many people? There's also, remember, this trade-off between targeting ability and cost per thousand. So the more targeted your ads are, the higher your CPM. Remember, we showed that with the executive human resources magazine example. The tighter your targeting, the higher your cost per thousand. There's also generally a trade-off between cost and effectiveness. Remember, we showed the CPM of billboards and the CPM of banner advertising and radio. These were all very low, but for television, it was much higher. And for AdWords campaigns, right? Google AdWords, that is the highest CPM because it's a very effective way of advertising. And this is generally known. The media knows this. Everybody knows you kind of get what you pay for. So just keep that in mind when it comes to decision making. And, different media have strengths that compensate for others' weaknesses. And this is like, again, takes into account this idea of the synergistic effect. We have to recognize that, not all media are created equal. And some have advantages like wide reach, some have narrow targeting, but they all used together, they can sort of compensate one for the other if it's done well. And then again, if it's integrated, though, you have to have a very integrated campaign for this to work. This idea of synergy, for the synergistic effect. And finally, all media suffer from a common problem, and that is clutter. If you remember, we talked about clutter. It's just the fact that there's so much advertising from all different products, all different brands. In women's magazines, you have like 30 or 40 pages of just advertising to get to the table of contents. With newspapers, you can go through the back and it's just like page after page after page of advertising. Or watching television, in the commercial breaks, you get a few minutes. So you get something like 15 minutes per hour of just advertising. There's one media I can think of that's generally low clutter. Off the top of my head, I can think of one, and that is bus shelter advertising. In bus shelters, uh, you basically just have the left and the right side and the back. You're standing inside a bus shelter. It's like there's not much clutter. You're just basically looking at one or two ads. Maybe inside a bathroom stall. That could be also maybe low clutter. Can you think of any other ones that are low clutter? Maybe maybe Google AdWords. If you Google something, you just see a few of those ads. You don't see a lot. So you get relatively low clutter in Google AdWords campaigns. But for the most part, almost all the other media suffer from this problem. So it makes it difficult to cut through, right? It just shows you how difficult the job is of getting noticed. It makes it really important to have very clever, creative, very high impact advertising if you want to get noticed. Okay, that's the end of lecture 7, and I'll see you again next week. Thank you.